the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie Millennium, released in 1989. The synopsis is, air raiders from the year 2989 travel to the past, rescuing passengers from doomed airplanes to repopulate the Earth. Millennium is based on a 1977 short story, Air Raid, written by American science fiction writer John Varley. John thought that Air Raid would make a good movie, so he started to work on a screenplay for the story in 1979 for Hollywood and expanded the story into a novel in 1983, also titled Millennium. MGM was interested in it, with Douglas Trumbull as one of the early directors looking to cast Paul Newman and Jane Fonda. It was also making Brainstorm in 1983 at the time. However, after the shocking death of Natalie Wood, who starred in the film, Douglas decided to drop out. John Varley said of his experience beginning in 1975, I ended up writing it 6 times. There were 4 different directors, and each time a new director came in, I went over the whole thing with him and rewrote it. Each new director had his own ideas, and sometimes you'd gain something from that, but each time something was always lost in the process. So that by the time it went in front of cameras, a lot of the vision was lost. And you can definitely see this effect on the story. It's one of the flaws, but the story kind of makes up for it in other ways, and I'll explain. At the tail end of the 1980s, Oscar-winning director Michael Anderson became attached to the project. Why should we get excited about this? Well, Michael is responsible for such amazing projects like The Martian Chronicles, a TV miniseries that was released in 1980 that I absolutely love, based on a book, of course. There's Logan's Run in 1976, and Around the World in 80 Days, released in 1956. If anyone could elevate this movie, it was Michael Anderson. Before I talk about the story, I want to warn you that it might give you the creeps if you're a person who has a severe phobia of flying. It could be a little triggering, so just wanted to give you a warning. And as well, please forgive me if it seems as if I'm telling the story from beginning to end. There are just so many little nerdy details that I want to get into about this film. And calling the story complicated is definitely an understatement. Now, the film starts out in 1989, where one plane is struck by another plane, and they both go down. But before they crash, one of the pilots reports that all of the passengers were already burned dead. Now, if that doesn't give you the creeps, I mean, you are a tough cookie. I don't know, I think when I first saw that in the movies, I was sort of like, what's going on here? I have questions. and that's exactly why that's there. And I'm mentioning this to you now because it does come into play later. The opening sequence was a little janky when it came to the chroma key work, and it's truly a product of its time in 1989. I don't think anybody ever did this right at the time. It was a very tricky technology, but seeing anything green screened kind of gave you the clue, like, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like. So you got sort of shadows of what something was supposed to look like, but it just wasn't perfected. However, the practical explosions and the destruction inside the plane gave the audience a point of view of what it would be like to be inside of a real plane crash. And it's both riveting and the stuff of nightmares. Very, very realistic. I think I was traumatized by this movie and somehow was like, okay, I just needed to see the rest of this movie. National Transportation Safety Board investigator Bill Smith was played by Chris Christopherson, most famous to modern audiences for playing Abraham Whistler in Blade, released in 1998 and subsequent sequels. He was also famous for starring in the romantic drama A Star is Born, released in 1976 with Barbra Streisand. Bill Smith is the central character that is investigating a very high-profile and baffling case of the two plane crashes. One plane was the DC-10 carrying 276 people, which went down 10 miles away from the other plane crash, which is the TU-835-747, which was carrying 364 people. The 747 crash site is where we are focused in for most of the film. By the way, this crash scene was so impressive, so much so that real-life pilots landing their planes nearby were radioing in that they thought this movie set was an actual plane crash. So that's pretty impressive. Now we see this kind of thing throughout the film where we have some surprisingly amazing set pieces for what seems to be a very low budget. And you guys know how much I love that. I love this kind of ingenuity. And again, you can see it all through the film. Now, these crashes seem to be an obvious problem with computers that the air traffic control was using. It's a pretty open and shut case with a few odd details. One of them was the black box flight data recording of the spooky last words that the pilot had mentioned. And it seems as all of the digital watches are counting backwards. All of the manual watches are ticking backwards. So it's a very unusual thing to be happening on this plane. And these are all clues that something strange is involved here. And Bill really wants to uncover every detail of that. I love the fact that this part of the film is approaching it like a detective story. And Bill is sort of the detective to try to figure it out. He isn't the most exciting character, even slightly charismatic at all. And I understand why. He takes his job very seriously. In this case, 640 people in total died in these crashes. So it's just horrible. He's dealing with the massive loss of life on a daily basis. So it's often that he barely even gets any sleep just to go over all of the details, to make sure he's getting it right, make sure he's making the right decisions, and save lives in the future. So with all of the stress on him, he really is a hollow resemblance of a human being until he meets Louise Baltimore. Now, who is Louise Baltimore, you may ask? Well, at first, she appears as a sexy flight attendant that Bill has a hot one-night stand with. Louise, you naughty girl. Louise is actually a time-traveling air raider with an awesome 80s hairdo who rescues doomed airplane crash passengers. Her team of 2 other women replace the passengers with organic lookalikes so that the crashes have visual casualties and not just empty planes. So this also reminds us about the beginning of the film when the pilot says he saw the passengers all burned. He was looking at these duplicates. This is, again, another creepy sequence that I really enjoyed seeing because it shows the advancement in their technology and the limitations too. They are able to create these unique biological forms, but they do not have the ability to create consciousness. The future is a dystopian world or something of a nightmarescape where most humans live in a dome called Coventry. Coventry is another pretty impressive set piece that is basically, I would call, the star of the film. It is used and reused a lot, and wisely so, because it really has an authentic look to it. It almost looks like the same plane hangar in which the investigation of the 747 takes place. And I might be wrong, but it looks possible. The production designer Gene Rudolph deserves a round of applause for his work on Coventry and how it gives us a dystopian flavor with all of those dark greens and all those stained walls. Everything looks very old and very weathered. Now, the time travel special effects in this movie are a little rudimentary to what we're expecting for our day. But in 1989, it wasn't too bad. Originally, I thought that this was achieved with animation, but the cinematographer Gene Ohashi filmed spinning metal wheels covered in mylar. They also used miniature models and a full-size mock-up planes combined with optical effects to make the planes look as if they were entering and exiting Coventry through the time travel gate. And this just is an example of how creative this production was trying to get with this picture. The future world has been stricken by pollution to the point that all of the humans are sterile and cannot populate. Many of them are part robotic, and sometimes they're just barely living body parts. The council that runs this world is composed of future humans that resemble scary Frankenstein experiments that are being kept alive in glass tubes. There are very few quote-unquote normal-looking humans in the future, and these people are assigned the job of air raiders who are able to pass for humans of the past the best. They are still damaged, though, by the pollution to the point that they have to smoke in order to breathe, and they too cannot reproduce. The air raiders are not just saving people from plane crashes just to be kind. They are trying to reboot humanity by taking them to a future time even further than their own polluted one. Since Louise is the captain of her own team, she has a personal robotic advisor by the name of Sherman. We can assume that Sherman is a robot, but he displays many human attributes, including emotions. He's even able to shed tears. So my assumption is that maybe he's a cyborg, composed of mostly robotic parts that are keeping him alive somehow. Louise is being played by Cheryl Ladd, most famously known as the fourth Charlie's Angel, who joined in 1977 after Farrah Fawcett left the show. I was and still am a big fan of Cheryl, so that was the main reason that I personally went to see this film in the theater, and she didn't disappoint for me. She's mainly known for being a TV actress, but also ended up doing a couple of mainstream movies like Lisa in 1989 and Poison Ivy in 1992. I enjoyed her portrayal of Louise, conflicted by what she has to do. However, I was a little disappointed that the production decided to use soft lenses on her to smooth out wrinkles, which was a common practice. She was only 38 at the time, and I thought she was still incredibly gorgeous. So it was a bit annoying that as you're trying to kind of see some clarity in the scene, it's completely impaired by this blurry soft lens. I did not care for it too much, and it really takes you out of the movie when that happens, because you know it's a vanity thing. But back to the story. In 1989, Bill encounters a character that he pretty much discards, and the film doesn't spend much time on him either. However, later on, this character proves to be extremely important. This is theoretical physicist and ecology professor Dr. Arnold Mayer, who displays a disturbing curiosity about the crashes in question and many other crashes. He has closely followed Bill's career, even reading a lot of his crash reports. He is a Nobel Prize winner, so perhaps this is the reason why he has clearance to visit all of these plane crash sites and perform his own investigations. It's not fully explained, but we can only assume that might be the reason why. Nevertheless, Dr. Mayer's theories involved the unhinged idea of time travelers. As we already know, he's not wrong. Dr. Mayer is being played wonderfully by Daniel J. Travanti, who at that time was very well known for playing Captain Frank Furillo on Hill Street Blues from 1981 to 1987. And that was one amazing show that I grew up on, and I can't believe that it never got a remake. Thank goodness. Daniel brings a creepy edge to the story that makes every scene he's in way more exciting than it has any right to be. He lends the character a dash of intellectual acumen and whimsy, as if he knows something that no one else does. And it's true, the character does know something that the other characters don't know. He knows about time travel. One of the movie plot points that I dislike with a passion happens to be time travel because it's so messy. However, some of my favorite movies are about time travel. So it's kind of a tough thing, but I think here they use it well. So it's very interesting that when used properly, it can actually be amazing of a concept. What's so marvelous about this movie is that we get this amazing commentary about the ethics of time travel delivered by Dr. Mayer in his lecture. He says, what will be the result of people traveling in time? For one thing, paradoxes become possible. Say you build a time machine and murder your father when he was 10 years old. It means you were never born. And if you weren't, how did you build a time machine? It's the possibility of paradoxes that make most people rule out time travel by human beings. Still, why not? If you were careful, you could do it. You would not go back to kill Adolf Hitler as much as you'd like to, because you would change history. A time traveler would have to be careful, but he could do a surprising number of things. And in this speech, Dr. Mayer mentioned things like taking a cup of water from the ocean or a rock from the ground. And that's true. If you could just imagine that, you've ever lost anything. What if time travelers just go around taking small things in our world to help themselves in their own? I mean, think of all those missing socks from the dryer. Gather up enough of them and you can make a sweater. It's stuff like this that endears me to these kinds of movies. This was the first time I had ever learned about paradoxes from watching this film, and I think the subject matter is fascinating. The film portrays paradoxes as something that resembles earthquakes in the future, and the movie even calls them something like timequakes. It's not fully explained, but I suppose their reality is experiencing small changes in their timeline. I almost wished at some point that it actually revealed some visuals, like color changes and size and shapes of things changing, maybe even characters changing too. That would be pretty awesome. I mean, paradoxes in itself highlights one of the terrible problems with time travel as a concept, because it's clear that what you do in the past will change the future. Even if someone just sees you, you've now changed the future world you came from. So it's a cool concept, but it always has with it the weight of a big mess. Now, I've told you the main conflict of the story. The secondary conflict of the story is the misplacement of two apparatuses from the future in the past. While on missions, the air raiders need to use stunners to put passengers to sleep while they transfer them off the planes. They lose a stunner at the beginning of the film in 1989, the quote-unquote present day the film is taking place. And they lose one in 1963, which is a plane crash that Bill Smith is actually on as a young boy. He survives that crash, and that experience inspires him to become a crash investigator. So I like how that moment in time not only serves as a pivotal moment for the air raiders, but it is a pivotal moment for our main character, Bill Smith. These stunners are very interesting. They have two parts that need to work with one another, a base and the handle. And the handle, I believe, is called the initiator. They lost the base in 1963 and the handle in 1989. The other detail is that the stunners can also be lethal, and that's the wild card in all of this because Dr. Mayer discovered the base of the stunner in 1963, but he doesn't have the initiator. So all this time he's looking at this thing saying, how does it work? I know that it's not from our time. It's not from my time. This is from the future, but he doesn't know how it works. So because Bill finds the handle in 1989 and meets up with Dr. Mayer, he is able to put together the stunner and it instantly kills the doctor. It's a pretty wild story. It's a lot to get through. And this is terrible because Dr. Mayer was supposed to stay alive for another 6 years to continue his scientific work. And this in itself creates a catastrophic paradox that is just too big to ignore. And I've always been a little bit upset at this point in the movie because Dr. Mayer, of all people, knew how precious it was not to mess with time. He gave a whole speech on it, and yet he chose not to even ask the time traveler that's standing right in front of him who says, I'll answer all of your questions, and he chooses to mess with an object he didn't know how to use from the future. It's a big flaw in the film concerning the nature of the character. The story and time literally falls apart as Bill and Louise go to the future to find it in utter chaos. I mean, it is in complete disarray. In the beginning, the time quakes were really kind of a minor inconvenience, but at the end of the film, at this point of the film, the entire structure of Coventry is exploding and falling apart. It's a spectacular scene bathed in an orgy of fire and a barrage of glorious practical explosions. I thought it was incredible. We have these huge, big set pieces and pretty good practical work that looks really cinematic. And it's a true spectacle in the film. Again, another amazing sequence with lots of pyrotechnics during the small budget they had. Another reason that the paradox took hold so intensely was also due to Bill's disappearance in his timeline. According to John Varley's original manuscript, Bill was critical to the National Transportation Safety Board's future, eventually becoming the director and saving a lot of lives. Bill leaving his world to be with Louise after one night together is a bit of a stretch for his character. I'm not sure if that's realistic, but we did establish earlier that his life was utterly miserable. Nevertheless, I thought he had lost his integrity by walking away from his work. Another major complaint of the film by many reviewers is that the film is told from Bill's point of view, and then at about the 34-minute mark, it shifts to Louise's point of view, which is not necessarily the complaint, but at about 54 minutes into the film, we get another 20 minutes of the first 30 minutes of the film we just experienced from Bill's point of view, now from Louise's point of view. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how they chose to do it. It's very convoluted and very mixed up. And many reviewers disliked this for a very, very good reason, because it really broke up the pacing and made things completely confusing. A lot of reviewers also had a problem with the love scene or the chemistry between the two actors, and I totally understand where they're coming from. I also felt as if there was a lot about Louise that was revealed in their interaction together. Louise was actually going through a change. She didn't even know how to kiss anybody, so this was all new to her, being close to another human being and being physical with another human being, intimacy. At one point, she had an apple in her hand that she dropped, and it's sort of suggesting that she was losing her virginity or her innocence, and I love that. One thing they reveal is that Louise is pregnant, which is not explained how. I mean, except for her having that one night stand, but we all thought that she was sterile. There's a small hint to the fact that her body was changing by spending time in the past, and Sherman indicates to her that she wasn't smoking enough cigarettes. And I suppose having someone else who's not sterile be the other party might be a contributing factor. Also, Louise's pregnancy leads me to talk about the end scene when she takes Bill to the future to face the paradox. During the crashes, the passengers are stored at Coventry, but since the timeline is unraveling, all of the passengers, Bill and Louise, are sent into a very far future beyond their time. This is a time in the future where the Earth has been healed from its damage, referred to as New Eden in John Varley's book. It's interesting that we don't see New Eden, but we do see the sunrise over the clouds, as Sherman's voice can be heard quoting Winston Churchill. This is not the end. This is not the beginning of the end. It is the end of the beginning. So the film is driving home that mankind is getting a second start somewhere in time in the distant future. So it's kind of nice to imagine that somewhere in the future, Louise and Bill are living happily together and having children in New Eden. And this really takes us back to the apple that Louise eats at the hotel. Louise is the new Eve. As proof that New Eden was their intention, there was a second ending, which was only released to international audiences. In that version, Louise and Bill materialize in the Garden of Eden in the far future. With all of this talk of pollution, there is also a mega huge commentary about climate change. Again, Dr. Mayer is the deliverer of this when he says, "We are destroying the planet we live on by complacency. He," meaning the future humans, "will have to live with our legacy of pollution and acid rain. Our negligence today is producing a world in which our children's children will be barren and the human race heading towards extinction." Need I say more? These are the reasons why I just adore this film, for all of the interesting concepts of the future and time travel. I know my review is a little all over the place, but that is because there were moments when the film nailed the visuals, and on the other hand, some of the editing and the color grading and written structure just feels like a decent television production. As well, I was looking into the budget for the movie, and there really is no indication of a budget anywhere. So that usually means that the budget was probably not substantial enough to record, and there may have been even borrowed assets from other productions. And that's probably where you find these areas where there's really great production, but there's no clue as to what those other productions were. So, I mean, this is like full investigation here, trying to figure out like the behind the scenes on this movie. And there really wasn't that much, and there really wasn't a lot of, or if any, promotion for the movie other than the trailer. This actually gives me a high indication that this is a low budget movie that really deserves a good look at what they're doing here. I have to give them a lot of credit for delivering as much as it did. And the story, by the way, is remarkable, but the execution did not quite work. Okay, so although it's flawed, oh so very flawed, there are so many little nuggets in this film that I simply love, including my fandom for Chris Christopherson, Cheryl Ladd, and Daniel J. Travanti. Ugh, big fans of those guys. And this makes this film a very, very guilty pleasure of mine. My rating is an 8.1. Well, that sums up my review. I hoped you liked it, and if you did, I've got over 100 of these videos, so go on ahead and browse the channel to see more reviews from me like this. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the bell icon to be the very first to be notified of my next video. I want to also take this moment to recognize my Patreon supporters who are responsible for helping me to produce this video. Many thanks to these incredible movie lovers for their support. And you too can be on this list by heading over to Patreon and getting a bit of behind the scenes stuff that you don't get from me on YouTube. You can also super thanks me if you would like. I will be putting all of the names of the people who give me super thanks on this list as well. And so I bid you adieu. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers.